This video is to show you how to assemble the strap pieces of the messenger bag. So I've already pre-done one of the steps that's necessary, and I'll explain that. But your messenger bag strap should be made up of 4 long strips. So you can see my fashion strips here, and then I've got my lining strips here. So it should be 2 pieces of fashion, 2 pieces of lining. Then the first step, which I've done already before this video, is to assemble these pieces. So I'm sewing together my 2 fashion or outside pieces and my 2 lining pieces so that I'm creating 2 big long strips. 1 big long strip of fashion, 1 big long strip of lining. So how I've done that is I've put my short ends together, pretty to pretty or fashion side to fashion side, and I've sewn my 1/2 inch seam on this short end. Then I went to my iron. I ironed this seam open, nice and smooth and flat, so I have 1 big long piece of fashion fabric. I'll do the same thing to my lining piece, and you can see that seam here. So I've matched up the ends, the short ends of that, sewn at a 1/2 inch and created 1 long strip. Now I'm ready to put the strips together that will make up the front and the back of my strap piece. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to focus in and line up seam to seam. Again, pretty side to pretty side or right side to right side so that I can see the seam allowances on both the front and back of these pieces as I'm putting them together. And it doesn't really matter which side you decide to stitch from, either fashion or lining side, it goes together the same. I'm showing you lining underneath. That's just sort of the way my brain works. I'm going to smooth out these pieces, and I'm going to stick a few pins in just to keep this stable up against my edge. So you can pin either way. You can pin this way vertically, or you can pin horizontally as long as those pin heads are all facing the same direction so you could pull them out before you hit them. But I'm going to make sure everything is nice and neat and lined up with each other as I go. And I'll do the same to this side and the opposite side. So it just takes a moment. Pinning is really the longest step in most sewing projects, that and cutting, of course. Get these ends to match up before I go too far, and then pin the rest of my side. And notice how if I'm pinning horizontally like this, that I am facing the pins all the same direction so I can pull those heads of the pins out as I sew. And then I'm going to flip it to the other side and do the exact same thing. So I'll make sure everything lines up nice and neat. Again, my pins, you can tell, are facing opposite directions, and that's because I'll put it in opposite ways as I sew it, as long as the head of the pin is facing where I can grab it and pull it out as I sew. You can run over pins if they are perpendicular to the direction you're sewing. Sometimes when you hit a pin, especially with the thin fabrics on the industrial machine, it will break your thread. So you'll be stitching along, everything looks good, and then you'll look at the back side and you've got a popped seam. So you do have to be careful of that, mindful of that as you're sewing. So sometimes pulling out the pins is better on some occasions. Okay, so now I'm ready to sew it. I've got everything pinned and ready. And my directions tell me I have 1/2 inch seam allowance, which means I'm going to line this up with my 1/2 inch seam allowance mark, like so, back stitch, and I'm going to stitch this whole side at 1/2 inch. Do be careful as you run over your seam that you keep your seam allowances flat and open as you run over them. You do not want them to fold over themselves. So often putting the pins through that to keep that stable is important. So I'm running over that with the seam allowance open. And while I'm stitching this, I am keeping both of my short ends here and at the opposite end open. I'm basically creating a long tube, and that's important because in the next step you will end up flipping these right side out, and so it's better to do so when it's a tube rather than a closed end. The end will get finished later when you assemble the bag. There will be no raw edges to the bag once you've put everything together. So I'm starting on the opposite side, stitching at a 1/2 inch. Almost there. And again, back stitching at my end, leaving the short side open because later I will turn this right side out by flipping it in a tube, but that will be in the next part.